Oh, can you enable my screen sharing, please?
I just started the recording, so.
Who's the host? Oh, there we go. Yeah.
That's me.
Yep. Okay. You can see that, yeah?
Yep.
Okay. Boom, boom, boom. No problem. Okay. Great. Okay.
Cool. Well, we have a few minutes, so we'll hang tight.
Can I just double check timing? I'm going to talk for like 40 minutes. Is that okay? And then questions?
Yeah, fine. Yep.
Okay. 40, 45, something like that. I mean, it's obviously, we're talking about Philadelphia, so I could go all night, but.
We can do part 2 if necessary.
Yeah.
That's a great idea.
I have been there when you did, Glenn.
Yeah, right.
They had to drag you off the stage.
That is, do you remember that, huh?
Oh, very well.
Who could forget?
Me and Gary Bennett.
Yeah, it's the only time I've ever been given the old heave-ho, I think. It taught me not to go over time. Well, it's not so much that I went over time in my defense. It was more that everything else was running late. I should have just been like, hello and goodbye. But live and learn. I was a wee thing at the time. You mean
Michael.
changed it all, Peter?
Michael Norris.
Mr.
Michael
Kill,
Norris.
how are you?
Are you outside or is that a fake picture?
That is a fake picture. I am.
I'd rather think you're outside in beautiful weather.
I know it actually does look exactly like this right now, but
Oh, really?
yeah, today was gorgeous.
Well, the pool chair is missing you. That's all I could say.
Dora Jacobson. Wow. Rick Snyderman. Gosh. I really, really wish we were all in a room together with alcohol. David. Hello, David Seltzer. Hello, Sarah Archer.
All right, well, it's just 5:30. We'll wait another minute or two for any stragglers. Yeah, we had over 100 people register, so
Oh, cool.
hopefully we'll get a few more.
Well, people know enough not to show up on time anymore, presume that they've been suckered that many times, right? So
Not in my world.
you obviously run with a well-organized crowd.
Citizens Climate Lobby. The trains run on time.
Yeah. Right. Well, if we're going to save the climate, we better get going. So sad but true. Carolyn is asking, does everyone know each other except for me? The answer is we know you now, Carolyn.
Yes.
Welcome to the fold.
Well, I think we should start just to be mindful of and respectful of those of you who are on time. So let's just dive in. Welcome everyone. to our presentation tonight with Glenn Adamson on craft and American history. I'm Michael Norris. I'm the executive director of the Carpenters Company in Philadelphia. We're really excited to partner with Craft Now Philadelphia on this event. And I also want to give a big shout out to Harvey and Virginia Kimmel and David Seltzer, all of whom are on this call and who helped make this event possible. So thank you to them. For those of you who don't know, the Carpenters Company was founded in 1724. We're actually the oldest craft guild in the nation. Our original members were master builders who built most of what existed in 18th century Philadelphia, including Independence Hall, Pennsylvania Hospital, the steeple at Christ Church, etc. But in addition to being builders, many of those folks were also artisans and craftsmen who made furniture and other kinds of decorative arts. So, and while the meeting place of the Carpenters Company, which you can see behind me, Carpenters Hall, is most famous for hosting the First Continental Congress in 1774. We also have a really amazing collection of early American furniture, which not everyone knows about, mostly Windsor chairs. Some of our chairs are actually on loan, and you can see them at Independence Hall and at the Museum of the American Revolution. Another thing that many people don't know is that the Carpenters Company actually exists still today, and it's a professional association of leaders who are involved in the construction and design and construction of buildings. Our main purpose is to preserve the hall as a historic site and a museum and its collections. Just a few housekeeping rules. Please try to stay on mute so we can be respectful of Glenn and all listen. And turning your video off does help with bandwidth, the more people we have. So if you can do that, that's helpful. We'll be answering questions at the end, so feel free to put those in the chat. And Alyssa will be moderating those when we get to that. And Glenn has actually made a special request. If any of the folks on the call tonight are makers themselves, please out yourself as such in the chat and tell us what you do so we can get a sense of who's in the audience. Finally, we have another event coming up this month called Designing in Brick, Flemish Bond, and author and historian Libby Brown, who some of you may know, is going to discuss the history of the distinctive brick making style that was used on Carpenters Hall and in many other buildings in the 18th century. So I'll put the registration link for that in the chat, and you can also find out about it on our website at carpentershall.org. So next, I'm going to pass this off to Layla, who's going to talk a little bit about Craft Now, and then Glenn will take us through.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Michael. I am truly appreciative that you invited Craft Now to partner with Carpenters Company on this event. We are thrilled to spend our first Friday preview with your formative institution for craft in Old City. It really just doesn't get more groundbreaking than the nation's first craft guild. In step with the Carpenters Company, I want to talk a little bit about what we have coming up. So as the original meeting place for the arts, science, and commerce, I want to invite the artists and makers in attendance tonight to learn more about our latest series of programs focused on economic opportunity through craft. The next Capital Now virtual event will take place Wednesday, May 26th at 5:30, and we're bringing together 3 grant-giving institutions to talk about their application process. They include Surf Plus, the Leeway Foundation, and the Velocity Fund. And also, just so you know, applications are now live for the Illuminate the Arts grants through the City of Philadelphia. Don't worry, I'm going to put a few links in the chat for you. Our Capital Now page needs to be updated. We just had our very first program last week, so please follow that. After hearing from Glenn, you are also going to want to be sure to head over to the Center for Art in Wood to see his work as curator of the exhibition Tom Lozier. Please, 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 on view through July 24th. This playful show encourages viewers to shake up their habits and interact with the environment and one another while considering issues such as body posture and etiquette that are often taken for granted when thinking about furniture. Lozier raises a clever question. If the furniture we sit on every day were totally different, wouldn't our lives be different too? And last but not least, I want to also share my sincere gratitude to Virginia and Harvey Kimmel, as well as David Seltzer, for their support of tonight's program. Their past support of our Craft Capital, Philadelphia's Cultures of Making book, which just so happens to also be edited by Glenn Adamson, carries over into tonight's conversation where we are going to learn more about not only the importance of craft in our history, but the resources that empower craft movements to thrive here in the city of Philadelphia. So learn more about us on our website and follow us, Craft Now PHL, on social media. And thank you again, Michael, for sharing this program with us tonight.
All right, Glenn, I think the floor is yours.
Excellent. Okay, well, hello, everyone. It's so great to be with you tonight. And indeed, I don't know if I can declare this for myself, but I would like to think of myself as an honorary Philadelphian at this point. I do have family in the city and just keep coming back to the rich history of craft making, artistry, and creativity in Philadelphia over and over again. I think part of it is because of the institutions that are in the city. Like Craft Now, of course, also the Center for Art and Wood. This current show that I have with Tom Lozier there is only the most recent project that I've done with them, going back well into the 1990s, actually, back into Albert Lecoff's time there. And then, of course, we have the Fabric Workshop, and then we have Carpenters Company, which I was not as familiar with until now, but boy, is it amazing to be hosted by the oldest craft guild in America. It couldn't be a more appropriate setting for the conversation that I'd love to have with you this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, actually, because I have quite a few images to show you, and it might be best to get started. What I'm going to be talking about is my book, Craft and American History, and I thought it might be worth saying just before I start that I found this book really difficult to write and sort of intimidating to write in a way that was new to me. I suppose it was partly a matter of writing popular history and also not writing art history, frankly. You know, I was trained as an art historian and not as a social historian or cultural historian, but also, again, to be quite frank, as a middle-aged white straight guy writing about the history of craft, which of course necessarily involves writing about the history of class, of gender, of ethnicity, particularly, as you'll see in my talk this evening, about the history of Native American and African American communities. You know, that was not something that I took on lightly. And it's something that I ultimately came to grips with through the words of Native American and African American people specifically. So with that in mind, I want to just start by recognizing the fact that I'm speaking to you from native ground, and by rights it still should be in many respects. So I'm actually speaking to you not from Philadelphia, but from the Hudson River Valley, which, as you probably know, used to be a major transit and trade route for the Haudenosaunee, otherwise known as the Iroquois Confederacy. So I think it's important to say that at the outset. Obviously, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania has its own very rich history of Native communities. And it's also why I wanted to start with this image, which is a work, as many of you will recognize, by the great artist Jeffrey Gibson, MacArthur Award winner now. And it's a particularly powerful example of his use of Native American craft techniques. What you're looking at is beadwork in the middle. I know it looks sort of like an LED sign, but that's actually all hand done with beadwork. And then the other materials like the jingles and the fringe are adapted from powwow performance costume. The quote itself is from James Baldwin, hence the JB at the bottom. And it says, "American history is longer, larger, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it," which has got to be about the best thing anybody has said about America. I mean, how true is that? And I think Baldwin here, and then Gibson, by reprising these words in this work, is capturing both the awe-inspiring positive qualities of American history and also the horrific aspects of American history, which of course include enslavement and genocide. So, that seems like a kind of heavy start, I realize, but I think it's also a necessary start, because if you think about craft as a true aspect of American history, not in the narrow museum bounded, gallery bounded way that we often engage with it, not even in the sense of professional identity as would have been underpinned by a guild like the Carpenters Company in the 18th, 19th century, or by trade unions, labor unions later on. But really thinking of it as part and parcel and an inextricable fiber of identity of all sorts of people through the course of American history, people that were both suffering greatly and also gaining advantage through their handwork. And so in a lot of ways, what I was trying to do in this book was write the story of America through the eyes of its artisans, not so much write the story of those artisans themselves, if you see what I mean. It's a very perspectival book, and it really rides for the most part on biographies. So the personal experiences and the accounts left to us by people like Paul Revere. Most obviously, I realize he's Boston, but he's on the cover of the book, so I threw him in here anyway. Or from the American South, there, Jessie Telfair, Alabama-based quilter who was involved with the Freedom Quilting Bee. And this is a quilt that she made in 1983, but clearly looking back on her experience in the civil rights movement, this repetition of the word freedom, almost like a chant that might have been offered by a parade of protesters in the 60s. You can imagine Martin Luther King at the front of the line and chanting freedom, freedom, freedom. So she's replicating this in the form of the quilt. And so, when I was thinking about how to put the book together, I was really thinking about how you could take emblematic figures like this, again, a white man of the middle class aspiring to more, aspiring to the upper class, in the case of Revere, from the North. In Jessie Telfair's case, an African-American woman from the South, a professional on the left, arguably an amateur maker on the right, although those definitions really get blurred. And think about craft as a way of binding together all those kinds of stories and everything in between. I think also the reason I wanted to show these two images on the front of the book, in addition to that sense of a range of different types of people, was that both of them offer a kind of reflection on craft. And what I mean by that is that there's a sense that craft is being offered as a metaphor as well as an actuality or as a functional aspect of production. So in the case of the Revere portrait by John Singleton Copley, you have a literal reflection. His hand is actually doubled in the surface of the teapot. So there's a very clear sense that here the hand of the maker is being presented to you not just as a utilitarian, needful thing, but also as an image, as a symbol, something potent and powerful. And then in the case of the Jessie Telfair quilt, similarly, you have a sense that the stitch work and the repetitive nature of that work echoes itself this idea of freedom and an idea of liberty or individualism. And I think if there's one thing that I took away from the experience of writing this book, it's that the ideology of American individualism is completely bound up with the story of craft and vice versa. And you really can't think about them apart from one another. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But first, I did want to bring us to Philadelphia finally and point out that, of course, you in Philly have your own famous maker of the Revolutionary era, not Revere, but Betsy Ross. This is a somewhat sentimentalized and completely fictionalized image of her sewing the first American flag. And as we now know, and sorry if everyone on the call doesn't know this already, because if not, I'm about to break your heart. But actually, Betsy Ross had nothing to do with the creation of the U.S. flag. Its design or its making, that was a legend put about by her descendants 100 years after the fact in 1876, the time of the centennial. She was an upholsterer, and of course, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, when Betsy Ross was running her own upholstery shop, having been widowed, it's one of the few ways that women were able to come into sole entrepreneurship. She did make flags and banners, so there was just enough of a kind of slim archival account to sort of hang this story on, but it really has no no substance to it whatsoever, sadly. But it is extremely interesting, isn't it, that someone like Betsy Ross has exerted such an incredible hold on the imagination of Americans ever since. You know, she and Paul Revere are almost like, you know, the man-woman team of the revolution, almost as symbolically powerful as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and of course this guy, Benjamin Franklin. And I thought it would be interesting to spend a little bit of time with Franklin. Here you see him in younger days, not the more familiar, bespectacled Ben, but here he is as the upwardly mobile, ambitious, thrusting young man who went over to England. This is a painting by Robert Feek that was taken of him as a first extant portrait of him. And you know, one of the interesting things about Franklin is that in some ways he shows through his biography the specific conditions that made American craft into this kind of individualistic phenomenon that I'm describing, starting with the fact that, of course, he absconded from his responsibilities as an apprentice. And I realize that we're being hosted tonight by America's earliest craft guild, but I do have to point out, I'm really sorry to say this, Michael, but American craft guilds were super weak and very few and far between, because there was so much mobility and also such a kind of volatile economy that it was impossible for them to exert the kind of controls on artisan communities that were possible, especially in cities like London and Paris, and to a lesser extent in regional cities and towns across Europe. So guilds were formed in America, but they very rapidly formed into something more like political associations, and they didn't tend to have the kind of control of skill training, of proper standards of manufacture, of pricing that existed in Europe. Although attempts were certainly made, they were very much observed in the breach. And again, Franklin is a great example of that because, having been apprenticed to a printer in Boston, he just ran and was never held to account for it. So there, of course, you see Poor Richard's Almanac on the right. And it's just fascinating to think about Franklin's statements about craft, of which there are many, many over the course of his career, which really installed him as a kind of representative artisan, again, nationwide and throughout the entire course of American history ever after. You can see him here early in his life, attesting to the importance of craft as a central cultural phenomenon. When we get to the slightly later publications of Poor Richard's Almanac, which of course was released in many, many editions over the course of his life and long after, we can see again this sort of pious, encouraging tone of exhortation that he adopted, sometimes writing things himself for inclusion in the almanac, much more often just stealing them without attribution. So it's a sort of, and that of course was a very common practice at the time, certainly nothing that made Franklin very unusual. But certainly this idea that, you would read the almanac as a means of reckoning with your own responsibilities and obligations and building yourself up as a so-called self-made man, which was the phrase that was typically used in the 18th and especially in the 19th century, was very much laid at Franklin's doorstep, and he was considered to be the patron saint of that deeply felt and very strongly emphasized ideology, this idea of the self-made man. And you'll notice it's not self-made woman, because this was also a very gendered dynamic, this idea that you could pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, as we say still today. I always like to remind people a physical impossibility to do that, was very much aimed at men. And, in some ways, of course, that ideology, insofar as it vastly outstripped the real possibility of social mobility that existed in America, was itself a kind of way of managing class conflict and what we now would call inequity, income inequity. So there's a kind of funny thing where Franklin becomes, on the one hand, the ultimate paragon of American culture, so much so that when I was growing up, my grandfather, who grew up in rural Kansas, used to literally quote Ben Franklin to me as a way of whipping me in to shave. But then on the other hand, there's a kind of resentment of this aspect of Franklin's persona. And I really love this quote from Mark Twain. So this is, of course, 100 years after Franklin, where he just sort of bemoans the way that that Poor Richard's Almanac is used as a stick to beat the indolent, of whom, of course, among whom, of course, he numbered himself. So this idea that, on the one hand, the self-made man myth is constantly being propagated and is kind of absolutely central to America's sense of itself. But on the other hand, the sense that this is in fact a myth, that it's very exclusionary, very much only aimed at white men, only white men upheld as examples of the self-made man, Franklin above all, and also that the myth itself has a kind of coercive aspect. And what's super interesting then is to follow this logic as it then intersects with marginalized communities, and particularly African-American communities and Native American communities. So I'll just say a little bit about that. This is going to take us away from Philadelphia just for a second. But I think it's really important to know this history. The two men you're looking at here are, of course, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, who were, I guess you could say, probably the two most famous African Americans in the 19th century. Certainly Douglass, who I believe it's said was the most photographed person who lived in the 19th century, because he had this incredible presence, as you can see, not only in photographs, but also in person, you know, an incredible orator with a story of torment and trauma from his childhood days. Eventually, his path led him to work on the Baltimore docks as a skilled ship's caulker, so he was actually an artisan himself, interestingly. Managed to effect his escape, went to the north, eventually went to England, went to Ireland. Everywhere he went, crowds thrilled to his oratory, and he became, of course, the great spokesperson for African-American liberty in the years before the Civil War, and then continued to be a kind of pole star for the community after the war. And he explicitly modeled himself on Franklin and the idea of the self-made man. So he himself subscribed to this ideology, and that in turn was very influential on Booker T. Washington, who again thought of himself as being self-made and tried to extend that lesson to other African Americans, especially in the South. He came to that politics, if I could put it that way, at a place called the Hampton Institute, before he went on to famously found the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. These are two images of the Hampton Institute, and you can see how intrinsic and important craft is to the education that was being handed to African Americans at this time. So literally building the school on the right, you can see the staircase being constructed. On the left, women in this very gendered scenario being obligated to use their hands to process cotton in various ways. These are obviously very staged photographs, but they do speak to a real truth of what was being taught in Hampton. And, you know, this was very controversial eventually, because Washington's broader politics, first of all, were thought to be extremely toothless. So there was a sense that he was really advocating a kind of pliancy and peaceableness during the midst of what were obviously horrific years for African Americans in the South. You know, this is Jim Crow, lynchings are happening. And really what Washington is advocating is a kind of go along and get along approach to racial relations. And so when somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois comes along, who's a much more provocative figure, powerful intellectual, he is going to specifically take issue with Booker T. Washington. They have a complicated relationship, but one of the specific conflicts that he has theoretically and politically with Washington is this idea of Black men and women being expected to learn manual skills and nothing else. So here you see one of these famous charts that he made for the 1900 Paris Exposition, the Exposition Universelle. And what he's showing you is how many students are in these various courses of study, as you can see. And the word here, industrial, obviously doesn't mean factories, it means manual labor. That would be the 19th century version of the term industrial. So basically the word craft, it could be here in our parlance. And you can see that, you know, hardly anybody studying business or classical or professional trades, and everybody's over in the shop. And, we might think, isn't it great that people are finding uplift through craft education? That's certainly what Booker T. Washington thought. W.E. Du Bois thought it was a big problem because he thought that that would consign Black men and women to being a permanent underclass. And the same set of issues arises in Native American communities, and even more traumatically so, arguably, because here you have people being ripped away from their homes. By the way, homes that were already set up after forced dislocation. So this, of course, would be the reservation system that's been enacted over the course of the 19th century. And so you have people like this, Tom Torling, the name that was assigned to him, and these Native Americans would literally have their names assigned to them at random off a chalkboard when they arrived at these vocational schools, places like the Carlisle Industrial School, which is in Pennsylvania, and they would be literally stripped of their traditional dress and stuffed into basically white man's dress. Shoes that they found incredibly uncomfortable. They would often comment on that. And you can see that in this pair of photos, there's even an implication that this person has lost their skin color somehow, been deracinated through this process of forced assimilation. Also should be said that these schools, not by design, but in a horrific repeat of what had happened in the 17th and 18th century when white colonists came to the Americas, disease was rampant in these places because people were being brought from reservations where there weren't diseases like tuberculosis and smallpox, put into these very close quarters, and many of them died and were simply buried on the grounds of these schools. So this is bound up with the story of craft as well. And again, I always want to emphasize that the story of craft, therefore, cannot be a simply celebratory one. It has to be one that reflects both the light and the darkness in American history. Also, really complicated stories like the Scouting movement, which in so many ways was an appropriation of Native American culture. Think of, all the names and the badge systems and everything that were generated around Scouting in the early 20th century. So that's an uncomfortable history, as Native American scholars have pointed out. At the very same time that Native Americans were having their traditions forcibly torn away from them, white children were being taught a kind of pantomime caricature of those same traditions as a means of kind of entertainment and education. And so, again, a really difficult history. And yet at the same time, if you were to ask yourself, what was the most important and influential craft movement of the early 20th century? Probably you wouldn't say the arts and crafts movement, you'd probably say the Scouting movement, because it affected hundreds of times more people and inculcated in them, again, this Benjamin Franklin style idea of making your own way through the skill of your own hands. That's what Scouting still today is all about in many respects, get your badges. And so here you see a group of early Girl Scouts with their handmade semaphore flags, another thing that they were being taught. And here you see, and again, a really interesting kind of resonance. You see Alice Paul there in the center, surrounded by other suffragists, sewing a star onto what they called the ratification banner. So the context for this, of course, is that they're pushing for the right to vote, which ultimately, as we know, led to the 19th Amendment, successfully allowing for women to vote and take part in the democracy of the country. And if you're thinking that this looks an awful lot like that fictional painting of Betsy Ross that I showed you earlier, you're absolutely right. And in fact, the suffragists explicitly used Betsy Ross and invoked her name to, I suppose, symbolize the sense of patriotic nationhood that they were trying to project here. So they weren't, running around smashing shop windows as British suffragists had done. They were instead trying to present themselves as upstanding citizens who deserved the right to vote and could be trusted to have that responsibility within the political system. And craft is, again, what they turned to in order to make that case. I did want to say just one thing about the issue of class, because I've mostly talked about race and gender. But it is really important to say that the white working class also, of course, has defined itself in terms of craftsmanship and artisanship. A fantastic example of this from Philadelphia would be the Tacony works that you see here. This is probably everybody knows this story on this call, but these are the sculptures that were put on the top of City Hall in Philadelphia. So they're by Alexander Calder, not the one that we all know, the Mobiles, but his grandfather. And I'm sure you all know that there's the 3 Calder sculptures lined up if you look out the front of the PMA, the Philadelphia Museum. Here's another one. This is William Penn's head next to one of the foundry workers. And so here you have this great, intersection of fine art and craft, a sculptor and the artisans, kind of early example of sort of fabrication we might now associate with, I don't know, Jeff Koons or, another artist of that stature. And, one of the things that's, again, extremely significant in the story of American politics and American society is that artisans are systematically de-skilled and marginalized and pushed to the edges of the economy. And it's really only in these extremely specialist bespoke trades like foundry work, as you see here. I mean, think about the difficulty of making sculptures of this scale and then mounting them on the top of that building. And so incredible artisan pride going into these kinds of works. But the kind of dynamic that we talk about all the time that even informed the politics of the Trump era in many ways, having to do with a kind of resentful working class that feels like it's being pushed aside, has actually been going on in America for like 300 years with greater and greater intensity. Now we talk about it in terms of automation, or we talk about it as offshoring of jobs overseas, but this was going on all the way back because of the rise of the factory system, the rise of machine production, division of labor, on and on and on. And of course, the Tacony works become part of that story because ultimately they're unable to survive, and they close, I think, in the 1920s, despite being able to do this kind of work. What happens then in the face of this consistent degradation of craft pride and craft skill and economic wherewithal is, of course, the arts and crafts movement and the studio craft movement that we know and love, which again were very deeply significant in Philadelphia, especially the studio craft movement. I think of the arts and crafts movement certainly has some ties to Philadelphia, but I think of that as more of a Boston, Chicago, New York phenomenon in some respects in terms of the national leadership. But boy, you cannot find a stronger set of crafts narratives leading to the studio craft movement than you can find in Philadelphia and its environs. And of course, Wharton Esherick, who in some ways is the great figure who falls between these two movements historically, and in many ways can be seen as the pioneer example of a studio craftsperson, as well as all the other things that he was, a sculptor and sort of vernacular philosopher, would be a great example of that. So would George Nakashima, who you see here on the right, wonderful photo of him with his daughter Mira, who's still making things with drills to this day. And there's of course the great story, great sad, tragic story of him learning his woodworking skills. Well, he had some woodworking skills because he was trained as an architect, so he could like make models in a sort of modernist way. But it wasn't until he was forcibly interned in a Japanese American wartime internment camp and met this fellow on the left, whose name is Kenneth Gentaro Hikagawa, that he actually learned traditional Japanese style joinery. And that of course became tremendously influential on his mature style that we all know and love. So again, you have a story there that's got pain and aesthetic achievement bound up in it. I'll just say the internment camps having been another of the darkest chapters of American history. Stanley Lexon, the great technician and innovator who taught at Tyler for so many years, not only developing these sort of precious Renaissance era or Baroque era skills like granulation, but also experimenting with electrotyping, electroplating, and eventually computer-aided design. So a real kind of forward-thinking figure. And, I could go on and on. Rudy Staffel. There's so many of the people on this call. Michael Broley, Peter Handler. Raise your hands. So the list of craftspeople in Philadelphia is virtually endless, seemingly. And of course, Philadelphia also was the setting for the first craft gallerist, first real studio craft gallerist, who, not somebody running just a shop with crafts in it like America House in New York, Eileen Osborne Webb's shop, but a proper ambitious gallery modeling itself after an art gallery. And that, of course, is Helen Drutt, who you see here at an early stage of her career, surrounded by some of her the things that she was showing at that time, jewelry and ceramics, her two principal concerns, although certainly not exclusively. And I should say the reason I have this image is because Sarah Archer, who's also on the call, wrote an absolutely sensational essay about Philadelphia's experience of the studio craft movement in this book that Layla already mentioned, Craft Capital. So this is something that I did together with a whole team of researchers and writers like Sarah and Craft Now. And if you haven't, by some wild chance, had a chance to lay your hands on a copy, do get one, because I think it gives a wonderful portrait of, as we say here on the cover, Philadelphia's cultures of making. Wonderful photography throughout. These are some of the images that, I think another thing to say about craft, not just in Philadelphia, but especially so in that city, is that it has this wonderful regenerative set of possibilities. So places like the Bach Center and Macon have reoccupied the exhausted industrial territory of the city, that landscape, and have reinfused it with a kind of creativity. You have companies out in the suburbs as well, like the Malmark Bell Company, which I was fascinated to look at as part of our research for the book. Of course, bell making being a craft with particularly strong resonance, pun intended, in Philadelphia. And then you have people like Michael Hurwitz and his partner Mami Kato, who are living and working in Fishtown in Philadelphia, another extremely important site for textile production, glass production, and other industrial trades. And then again, reoccupying, as you can see, the lovely exposed brickwork here, these previously industrial spaces and making them into what are effectively craft and art studios. So it's all to say that the story of American individualism extends and carries on into the present. Again, I would say especially in Philadelphia, although not exclusively. You can see it all in every corner of the country. Here's one of Michael Hurwitz's beautiful works. And in so many ways, it's still looking back to that ideology of the self-made craftsman, if I can use that term. But the great thing, of course, is that now we have the opportunity to think about this history in its full dimensionality from every side simultaneously. And that's really what I was trying to do in the book, to think about James Baldwin's words and tell the story in an inclusive manner that actually represented everybody who's been an American craftsman. And I've found here tremendous inspiration from artists like Jeffrey Gibson, or here Simone Lee, whose powerful sculpture Brick House has now just come to live in Philadelphia permanently. Here you see it in its new home, and I'm sure everybody's seen this either in Philly in its new location or on the High Line. And this is my last slide, but this sculpture, which seems at once like a figure and a fortress, as an image of defendedness and protection, but also supreme confidence and assertion, a kind of staking of the ground. Also, this really fascinating thing that Simone Lee does in her work to erase the eyes of the figure in a way to, I think, generalize. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but the way that it seems to me is that she's generalizing the figure so that it reads as a Black figure, but also not as one specific person. So it's somewhat coincidentally, I think, but also very powerfully, I think her work is almost like the aesthetic analog of the idea of Black Lives Matter that we're now so familiar with. This, this phrase that rings out like freedom did in the 1960s or the 1770s. And the fact that Simone Lee was trained originally as a ceramic artist, You might even think of the famous face jugs, African-American face jugs of the 19th century, as being one of the proximate influences here, one of many that she's thinking about. Also African hand-built architecture, which informs the structure of the lower part of the sculpture, braiding and hair work, of course, another very important African-American skill. You know, this is clearly an artist who is absolutely saturated in her own craft skill and in the historical trajectories that have led up to this moment. And, you know, she's about to go and represent America at the Venice Biennale. You know, she's the artist for the US Pavilion. And I just feel like the fact that we've arrived at a time in history when a Black woman has that kind of representative power, the kind of representative or symbolic power that we used to reserve for Paul Revere and Betsy Ross, and the fact that she can be both a craftsperson and an artist at the same time, and that there not be any conflict between those two roles, that they be seen as completely mutually supportive and amplifying, that to me suggests that whatever else we can say about this beautiful, terrible, vast history that Baldwin spoke about, we can say that things do actually get better. And I think that craft has had a lot to do with that, frankly. And that's one of the reasons that I continue to want to champion it and come down to Philly, where it lives more vibrantly and vitally than probably anywhere else. So that's what I'm going to say with slides. But I hope you might have some questions or comments for me or for one another.
Thank you, Glenn. That was fascinating as somebody who came into this knowing nothing about craft. So I really enjoyed that. We are going to start with Thora, who had a thought going back to the beginning of your talk. She said, I have always thought that the Carpenters Company was a very strong entity. They truly controlled architecture. Flemish Bond is no joke. So sorry to start with the self-promotional topic, but Glenn or Michael, if either of you want to jump in on that one, feel free.
Well, I just want to say this probably says a lot about me. I sort of wish I were listening to the Flemish Bond talk rather than talking myself. It sounds completely fascinating. But, you know, it's a good example, I will say, of the fact that craft is hiding in plain sight, as we say, because I dare say that tourists and, you know, permanent inhabitants of Philadelphia walk around the city all the time without thinking about what it would take to make that kind of brickwork, even though it's literally staring them in the face. And it's just so great that you can turn around and point to it and say, look at that and think about it, what it took to make what I call the material intelligence that it took to make that. So I think it's so great you're bringing somebody to talk about that in some detail.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you know, from our understanding about the history of the Carpenters Company, yes, we were pretty influential in, you know, how buildings got built and what buildings got built, especially in the 18th century, less so as we moved into the 19th century. I turned my background off because I wanted to show this book, which may be some with, but this is a facsimile edition of our 1786 rule book, which set prices for building techniques and also standards and practices for how to actually build stuff. And it was a closely guarded secret of the company. When a member died, someone else from the company showed up at their house to take back their copy of the rule book so it wouldn't go into nefarious hands. And there's an apocryphal story that Thomas Jefferson, who was of course himself an architect and a builder, wanted to get, requested a copy of the rule book from the company. This was much later, after the Revolution. And he was refused because he was not a member of the company. So there was a sense of control and some degree of power that you know, that the company exerted, certainly in Philadelphia. But again, that began to dissipate into the 19th century The company was actually the target of some early examples of labor unrest in Philadelphia, by apprentice and junior carpenters, protesting against the master builders, and of course then unions started to come into the picture later on. And the other thing that really changed for us is the building, right? So through a sort of happenstance of history, the site became historically significant because of the First Continental Congress, and that developed into the primary mission of the organization. So we often talk about, would the Carpenters Company still exist if there was no Carpenters Hall? The answer is probably not, because obviously most of the other guilds that existed don't anymore, so because their purpose has been diffused or picked up by other kinds of organizations.
It's fascinating. It might just be worth pointing out that one of the things that's happening in the background of that story that Michael's describing is that the very identities of being an apprentice or a journeyman get converted from legitimate sort of mileposts on the process of being trained as a craftsperson to being more like wage brackets. So you get stuck as a permanent apprentice or journeyman rather than being on a kind of ladder of skill, which was the idea, of course, of the guilds when they were first set up in the Renaissance period. So the reason that guilds, become targets of protest, and also that they eventually transmute into labor unions, which are much more blunt political instruments, is because the very identities of the artisans that are fundamental to the guild structure are themselves being degraded by what's effectively a capitalist division of labor-oriented factory system. Interestingly, it's not so much because of machines, by the way, because machine production, I think a lot of people just think like a light turned on in the late 18th century and suddenly everything was being made by machine. But if you think about, if you've ever looked at a 19th century machine, it will immediately occur to you that it probably wouldn't be good to make too many types of thing. So really good at textiles, not so good at most other things. So furniture, ceramics, glass, building trades, obviously, the foundry that I showed you earlier, all of those things remain artisanal well into the 19th century, in some cases well into the early 20th century, and of course in some cases even today.
Right.
So a lot to say there, but yeah, it's a really great history, and again, not one that you generally get if you think about craft in a museum context. You have to think about these other kinds of organizations like Carpenters Company.
Well, I think as a smooth transition here, Peter said that he would like a discussion about individualism, craft, and politics. And earlier he commented, the idea of American individualism goes back to the founding of the country, Lockean liberalism. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is an essential individualistic concept.
Yeah.
Which, if I could expand before you get going a little further, has a great deal to do with both the genocide and racism that we've experienced in this country, and the unfortunate politics that we seem to have now. The idea of us as individuals rather than, and we saw it particularly with the pandemic, of people stressing their own individual rights rather than seeing ourselves as part of a community, with a social contract.
Yeah. It's a quite extreme phenomenon that you're describing, Peter, and you're very right to add further emphasis to it. I always think that like claiming the individual right to not wear a mask is pretty much on a moral level of claiming an individual right to drive down a highway blindfolded, because you just don't know who you're going to kill. But it's like, I don't care, because no one should be telling me what to do. And that is not unique to America, but boy, do we ever have a complex about it. And it does go back to past the founding of the century, the country, it's completely bound up with the frontier mythology that I haven't really talked about, but is a very important part of that self-made or autonomous ideal. And it's also, again, not to belabor the point, it's very much bound up with ideas of class, gender, and race So I just also curated a show out at Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas, which is called Crafting America. So for me, it was a sort of sibling project to the book, post-war craft exhibition, craft and art in relation to one another. And we actually structured the show on the basis of the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the first question we wanted to ask was, whose life, whose liberty, and whose happiness are we talking about here? And then think about craft as a way of claiming those rights effectively through a kind of creative act. And you can see that across such a wide span of people. And I've only used a couple of examples of that, like Jeffrey Gibson and, George Nakashima and Kenneth Hikagawa in the internment camp. Simone Lee, obviously, it seems to me an exemplar of that. But it's you just cannot understand the resonance of craft either as a popular vernacular phenomenon or as a very self-conscious revivalist movement-based phenomenon, as in the studio craft movement, without getting that backdrop in your head, because that's what it's really about for me, more than it is about the objects. It's about that idea of a member of the community. I didn't say this actually, and let me just emphasize it because it's such an important thought, I think, at least to me it seems like it, that the definition of the role of a craftsperson is that they're both a proud individual and somebody who is completely tied into their community. That's the key, right? So they're the meeting point of the two things in a way that's holistic, integrated, organic, suggests ideas of reliability, responsibility, truth. And I think that's real. I mean, okay, Betsy Ross didn't sew the flag. So there's a lot of like fake news in craft history too. We know this, but there's a real thing there about artisans being the point of intersection between individualism and community values in a way that actually the more radical communitarian politics, let's say the Marxist influenced revolutions of 1848 through, let's say, the Soviet and Chinese revolutions, right? That's the opposite ideology to the American capitalist ideology. And you could argue that's too far in the other direction, obviously. There's a lot of reason to think that given what happened in those places. And I feel like the ideal of the craftsperson is that happy middle, right? Where the value of individualism, the value of community togetherness is somehow brought into a complex balance. And for me, the tragedy of the relegation of craft to the margins of the society and the economy, again, is not so much because the objects get worse, because in a lot of ways they don't. I mean, machine-made objects can be amazing, right? Better than anyone could make by hand, and cheaper too. The problem is that you don't have the people anymore that have that central trusted role. So that's where the ideals of individualism and the ideals of community have nowhere to anchor into one another, or at least a much weaker anchor than the craft economy could have provided. You see what I mean?
Yeah, it's also making me think about guilds as the sort of fulcrum of individuals and community, right? So it's like, here's a way to join the guild. You'll get the sort of tools and resources to be your best individual artisan, but yet you're still part of this community.
Yeah. And of course, the politics of that gets worked out, including, we have to say, that the guilds themselves were very exclusionary, right, phenomena along many of the lines that we were talking about, also native and immigrant as well. We shouldn't forget that too. So it's like, whose community are we talking about here? And that does tend to get bounded. So there's a politics to that too. But the model is still a very inspirational one, because if you can have the guild idea without the exclusionary attitudes, then you're really thinking about something that has a kind of complexity and knowledge and sophistication built into it that is precisely, as you describe, a way of balancing the interests of individuals with the collective.
So to push on this conversation a little bit further, David says, I would be interested hearing your views on the political role that the practice of craft could play in convening people from different backgrounds in today's fractured society. So I know we touched on that a little bit, but I am sure that there's more to say.
Yeah, and this is a slightly different thing because now we're talking about now and into the future. And David, please jump in here if you'd like. But I'll just say to start with that I do think of craft as a potential social adhesive. And one of the reasons that I think that, I mean, I'm aware that this might sound like crushingly naive, especially given everything that we've been talking about, which seems kind of daunting. But I think that craft is one of the very few cultural values that pretty much everyone can get behind. More than contemporary art, more than certainly architecture or the idea of avant-garde anything, music, dance, etc. Those things, rightly, as much as I love them all, and they make up a huge part of my own life, they are rightly seen as very elitist, and I understand myself as part of that elite, right? I want to be very self-conscious about that. But craft is not like that. I mean, it does have elite formations. The studio craft movement arguably was one, as was the arts and crafts movement, although it struggled against that, wanted to be less elite, couldn't quite figure out a way. But, you know, if you divorce craft from the kind of high-flying professional identity, the Michael Hurwitzes of the world, I mean, obviously Michael Hurwitz is a very elite person on every level as a human being as well as a maker. But you know, his tables are not going to be cheap, yeah. But craft penetrates deep, deep. I mean, its tendrils go right into the loamy earth of vernacular culture. And you can go to any state in the country, red, blue, or purple, and find craft fairs and organizations and people going to their local craft store and reading magazines and piling them up in the corner and never getting around to that project. You know, and of course, some of it is exploited, and companies like, you know, Michael's Superstore, I actually write about this a little bit in the book, Martha Stewart, sort of make this into a strategy and it becomes manipulated to some extent. But again, it's still real. So I think that there's got to be some common ground there, you know. I mean, I mentioned my grandfather earlier, and he was a really right-wing Republican, and we used to fight like, you know, vociferously about things once I got old enough to stand up to him. But then we'd go down to his wood shop and I'd watch him carve something, and it was great, right? And everything would be okay again. And I think that kind of phenomenon is not certainly in any way unique to me or even unusual. I think that idea that craft is something that's so porous and so inviting and so relatable that people can use it, precisely as David says, as a means of convening people from different backgrounds and different ideas, that is really, really, really powerful. And I always feel like organizations like Craft Now, which is doing this effectively, but Craft Now, the American Craft Council, the museums, the medium-specific organizations, that should be the goal, to use these platforms as a way of getting people in the same room when ordinarily they would be yelling at each other over Twitter.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions or topics that they'd like to explore?
Well, I'm curious about this whole chair thing that's going on with Thora and Peter, because I'm not familiar with that book. I was just Googling it. And since I mentioned chairs in my introduction, and we have a great interest in chairs at Carpenters Hall, including the speaker's chair from the First Continental Congress is in our permanent collection and on display. The idea of chairs as the seat of authority and what that means is really interesting to me. So I don't know if Peter or Thora want to kind of comment on that.
Sure. It's something that Galen actually explores in great depth in that book. I'm sure Glenn knows the book. You know, the interesting thing about chairs is that the chair as we know it, as a four-legged piece of furniture, is really a very modern invention. We did see them in Egyptian tombs, but they were there for the dead. And what they really had to wait for was perfectly even and flat floors. So what we saw was three-legged stools, but chairs probably only go back, and Glenn, you could correct me, maybe 400 years or so, as a structure that we know now. And that chair is I always think of bridges as both architectural elements and metaphors at the same time, in the sense that it's always connecting places and people. And chairs also, the idea of a chair person or a chairman, that the chair as a center or the lead. It's an interesting connection that is worth talking further in its quality as a metaphor.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, as people often say, it's very anthropomorphic, and we talk about chairs as having seats, backs, and arms and legs. I think what I would say is 400 years old is the idea that most people would sit in chairs instead of on benches, or in most parts of the world on the floor. Of course, still in Asia and Africa today, you would have many floor or ground-based cultures. There's also a fantastic kind of subplot there about how craftspeople themselves are positioned when they make. And Ned Cook, my former mentor, current mentor really still at Yale, has done a lot of work, for example, on the kind of physical differences between being a metal worker in India working on the ground and being a metal worker in Europe or America working at a bench standing or seated. And of course, it changes a huge amount of what you can do or can't do. For example, Indian makers use their feet a lot, which Euro-American makers tend not to hardly at all, unless they're hitting a pedal. So that's another fascinating thing, like not just the chair itself, but also what you do in it, which becomes a part of craft history. Maybe we're saying a little bit about Windsor chairs specifically, just to geek out a little bit. I mean, you're about to do Flemish bonds, so why not, right? But by the way, the reason it's called a Windsor chair is not because they're from Windsor, Connecticut or anything. It's because they were, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but it's because there was a trading site near Windsor Castle in England. So the chairs could be brought there by river and then traded out into various trade routes, overland trade routes. So that's why they're called Windsor chairs. But that also maybe betrays something of their kind of economic identity. And it's super interesting that the convention and this sort of seat of American power was specifically outfitted with Windsor chairs because they're a super vernacular, affordable type of seating. The reason being that you could make vast numbers of components, often, by the way, during the winter when you weren't harvesting. So a lot of people that made Windsor chair parts or full chairs were also farmers during the season when they could actually raise crops. And what they would do is make these huge piles of turned elements, the spindles and the legs, steam mend the backs if they were using steam mend bow backs, and then they would carve out the seats, and then you just assemble it like a tinker toy, right? And I mean, I don't want to make light of the craft involved because the geometry of it to begin with is pretty intense. Actually, Tom Lozer's show over at the Center for Art and Wood, Please, 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 a lot of what he's doing is actually based on Windsor chair forms that he's kind of adapting and exploring. He's talked a lot about the hideously complex geometry that you need to be able to master to do that. But in terms of just the kind of raw speed and efficiency, it was a sort of groundbreaking chair form. And you could think of it as the kind of Model T of its day, so mass production furniture. So that's why it's in Philadelphia, and arguably it was sort of meant, either it was convenient for them to get all those chairs made, and or it was a representation of a kind of democratic ideal to be sitting specifically in Windsor chairs. Okay, furniture history geek out session over.
Moving away from chairs,
Moving right along.
Layla asked, what role might craftspeople play as we emerge out of the pandemic, given the disruption in the global supply chain and craft being more sustainable environmentally, etc.?
Good question, Layla. And I saw actually somebody else made the amazing point that Laura Keem said that the Simone Lee is like the reverse of what we're getting all the time now, because we're always getting that, and she's doing that instead, which of course is totally coincidental because she was making that work before the pandemic, but it does make it maybe even more resonant. Yeah, I thought about this a lot, but not to any particularly satisfying conclusion, I have to say. I think you could sort of file this under the heading of I'm a historian, not a futurologist. And it's a little bit difficult to predict anything, much less something as sensitive as craft and its registration of economic realities. But I think if I were to lay money on it, I would say that craft is going to come out of this moment with a tremendous burst of energy, because for starters, a lot of people have been thrown back onto their own resources anyway, even psychologically, and so it's been a really important moment of re-engagement with craft, even if only on the hobby level. But also in a very counterintuitive way, the larger economy and people's habits are built up around distance, like what we're doing now, the easier it is for craft people to make a living, because you can replicate the face-to-face contacts and distribution strategies that would have existed in the 18th century in a village. You can replicate all of that online. So you already have seen in the last 10 years, let's say, this tremendous growth in craft-based businesses because of the existence of internet-based communication tools. So it's a really interesting thing where the digital and the analog are actually supporting one another rather than in conflict. Although in another way, you could say the reason people are turning to craft so enthusiastically now is because they're so sick of their screens. So it's like a win-win scenario for craft, if you like. And I think especially as people get more and more angry and hostile towards the Amazons of the world, and it becomes easier and easier to figure out a way to like work out bespoke anything, furniture, shoes, whatever, and that some of those pricing points go down too because of the introduction of digital tools into craft workshops to find more efficiencies. I think you're going to see this current craft revival or renaissance just going and going and going, and I don't see any reason that it would stop, frankly, unless the prevailing economy completely falls into collapse because of climate change, which could happen. But even then, I think craft would become a big important part of the answer too, because it does have a sort of localism and an ecological sensitivity that mass production often lacks. So it's hard to see craft losing its energy anytime soon. That would be my prediction, but I would say that.
Well, it wasn't the arts and crafts movement. I could be totally wrong, but my limited understanding of arts and crafts is that it was a partial pushback against the Industrial Revolution and kind of a call to honoring local traditions. So my thought with, this global supply chain is, do you think this moment could bring a resurgence in local crafts and honoring of where we are, instead of trying to reach across from crafts all over the country or the world, and maybe start a new emergence of craft?
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting idea. I think you're absolutely right about the arts and crafts movement being a way of contesting industrialism and what William Morris called the trade finish, everything looking kind of slick and like it just came off an assembly line, although there weren't assembly lines yet then. But I'm not sure I would say the arts and crafts movement was actually very attentive to localism per se. It was, as I said, it had a kind of propensity to appropriate. So there was a lot of like Chicago silversmiths making silver bowls that looked like Native American baskets from the Southwest, that kind of move. that now seems like eek, horrible, And I think certainly there's a lot more awareness around that now. I think right now maybe it's a bit of a both and. Like there's a very powerful sense of localism that's embedded, but also, of course, the internet allows you to have things flying all over the place, and craftspeople do send things all over the place. So again, I think it's kind of a win-win situation for the makers. It is like, yeah, it's like, as Margarita just said, hand in hand with an agrarian movement. It's very much like farm to table, that sort of idea about eating. And of course, with food, you have the additional thing of freshness, which enforces localism in a way that man-made objects is not relevant.
Thank you. So I want to make sure we get to everyone's questions. And Lauren asked, is there a right way to teach and enjoy crafts with groups of children that appreciates and respects cultures rather than appropriates? Which is a great question.
That is a nice question. Yes. I mean, I'm probably not the best person to speak to that because I don't teach children. So I don't have a lot of expertise to bring to bear. I think I would say in the more general sense of the question about how do you not appropriate, I don't actually think that the answer there is to like, if you're white, only make things and think about things that white people have done. I really, really don't think that's the answer, because I think the idea of us all like going to our own rooms and slamming the door that just can't be the way forward, I don't think. And I mean, I'm obviously a white guy, so maybe it's easy for me to say that, but I feel like the challenge is more about creating collaborative, creative spaces in which people from different perspectives can come together than it is a matter of walling yourself off in this kind of Trumpish, like literally built the wall kind of attitude. I think it's got to be more about, certainly not speaking for people or, taking their creative tradition in a sort of uninvited or decontextualized way. It's just about, bringing people together in a way that is mutually invented and mutually beneficial. I think that's got to be the goal. Sort of like what I was saying about the role of institutions now in organizations.
And Elizabeth says, source communities are a big part of avoiding appropriation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, well said.
So I'm sorry, that's my dog whining. That's not me making crying noises. Does anyone else have any last questions or final thoughts?
I noticed we had a question from Patrick Deuce. Do you want to take that one?
Yes, I'm sorry, Patrick, I missed that. Is there a history of when craftspeople started to sign or mark their words to identify them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there's a special case which is in precious metal work. You have the practice of hallmarking, and that's really not about authorship. It's about basically, what's the word? When you're claiming accountability. So when if you're a silversmith like Paul Revere and you release an object out into the world, you mark it because if it turns out not to have the right amount of silver in it, as compared to other cheaper base metals, then somebody can come back to you and say, hey, how about it, right? So that's the reason that you have silversmiths marking things. It's not until very late that you start to have people marking craft objects in a spirit of, I made this in a creative way. I mean, there are some exceptions like, house joiners writing their name in chalk on the inside of a board and then closing up the wall. There's cool things like that. And then there's the whole other similar and fascinating phenomenon of dating objects. I actually just did a big project about that called Marking Time. We had a book come out from Yale about it that is about why people dated things in the 17th and 18th century. Is very striking. As people started dating their candlesticks and their dishes and their tablecloths, and it's like, why? And one of the thoughts that has occurred to us is that maybe it's a sort of appreciation of some form of modernity happening, like people start to be aware of time changing things faster and faster, and so they have this instinct to mark the moment in a new way. But it's not until probably even the arts and crafts movement that you would have individual makers rather than companies really getting into the idea of marking things as a form of authorship as opposed to just a kind of trade necessity. Again, there are exceptions to that, like caners, who, caning chairs, putting the bottoms into chairs in the 18th century. They would sometimes mark their work, and furniture makers would sometimes mark their work. But again, that was more of an accountability thing. Like I'm taking responsibility for this object idea rather than this is my artistry.
We actually have a Carpenters Company mark that in our collection that was used to mark chairs, and you can see that mark in our main exhibit, and an example of its use on a chair from the 18th century.
Nice. I guess the other reason that people were doing that was not just accountability. It was also because a lot of chair makers and other craftspeople, by the way, even gravestone carvers, amazingly, were shipping their stuff in large quantities, up and down the eastern seaboard especially. So there's also the possibility that people were marking things to make sure that they got paid. So again, very functional. Yeah.
Howard asks if you can speak about the Inuit.
Wow.
It's a good question.
Speaking of things I'm not expert in, can I speak about the Inuit? Well, yes. I mean, that's another case where you have a native or indigenous community that bears the burden of a huge amount of symbolic capital. And so, I always think of the film Nanook of the North, who is, he's of course an Inuit person. And that's a very early film, right? So probably 1920s. Does anyone know? Late 20s, silent film. And it's a craft documentary, basically. And it's not all craft, it's like fishing and so on, but it's how does he build a canoe? What does he wear? How is it possible to survive in this incredible environment? But of course, it's also totally staged. So it's very much like some of the other constructions of native culture that I was sort of alluding to. There's a lot more about this in my book if you're interested. The way that authenticity is kind of built out of the, on top of the native, on top of native people as a way of seemingly honoring them, but actually controlling them. And as I understand it, between takes in Nanook of the North, they were all like sitting around having a smoke together. He'd put his real clothes on, kind of thing. So I probably should have put it in the book, actually. It's a really good example of the sort of phenomenon I'm talking about. The other thing that occurs to me about Inuit people is that there's also this really fascinating and difficult question about who gets to count as Inuit or as a member of another tribe. And we actually ran a really great article about this in the Journal of Modern Craft, this academic journal that I edit a long time ago. It was about something called the Silver Hand Program. And basically, it was a matter of recognizing, the idea was very positively to recognize people who were genuinely Inuit or other Alaska Native as a way of protecting their craft production. So you're marked with a silver hand, like you're really Inuit, and you get to use this as a sort of symbol. So like truth in advertising kind of thing. But it actually turns out to be super problematic and controversial, because who gets to decide who the Inuits are? And you end up thinking about crazy things like how many of your bloodlines go back to Inuit people, and what should the number be? Like, is 50% enough, or has it got to be 75%? And you get a Native American artist called Greg Deal said to me, Native people and horses and dogs are the only entities who are treated this way, right? That your specific heritage would be held to that kind of examination, like pedigree. And he, of course, thought that was, highly, highly objectionable, even though it came out of what seems to be a very honest attempt to kind of respect and protect Native identity, and in fact, something that Native artisans themselves were demanding and pushing for. So again, you see the kind of conflict that arises out of questions of identity like that. No easy answer. So 1922, Nanook of the North. Thank you, Michael. Wasn't far off. That is early, right? That's like Buster Keaton time.
I believe it was the first like blockbuster film that was released across the country, if I remember my film class from many years ago.
Is it before Birth of the Nation? Because I always think of Birth of the Nation as being
Yeah, no, that was 1915.
15.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm mixing things up. This is why it's been a while, and I'll just stop talking.
But plenty early though. Yeah, and as Carrie says, of course, it's not just the Inuit, it's many different people, like the whole country, Canada as well. You know, just to state the obvious, Native peoples did not organize themselves conveniently according to our state boundaries. And there's actually a really, I wish I could remember the website name. There's a great, you'll probably find it easily if you're interested. There's a great set of maps that have been put together, I think fairly recently, of Native, of Indigenous communities and where they lived at different points in history, that partly so that you can do a kind of formal recognition of land rights, like I did at the beginning of the talk.
There's also a number you could text. I'm trying to look for it, that if you text it your exact location, it'll tell you which tribe the land you're living on belonged to. I'll see if I can find that.
Of course there is.
Yeah, of course there is.
It's like there's an app for that, right?
Right.
Any other final thoughts in our remaining few minutes? Oh, well, Glenn, thank you so much. This was fabulous and informative and a wonderful conversation. Michael or Layla, would you like to add anything before signing off?
Get the book.
Yes. Tomorrow when I send out the recording, I will send a link to all the books mentioned today.
Yes, I really loved seeing a lot of the photos included in Craft Capital.
Yeah.
And Sarah Archer did indeed write a beautiful and sweeping essay of the history here in Philadelphia.
Yeah, must read. So get both books.
Yes.
No pressure.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And
Thank you, everyone.
everyone has a wonderful evening.
It was
Thank you.
wonderful to see all of you. Thank you.
For tuning in. Bye.